The sound should not have been there. Not in the middle of the desert. Not beneath a gas pipeline trench. Not 42 years after anyone stopped asking questions. The excavator's steel bucket struck something solid with a hollow, metallic thud that cut through the roar of the wind. The machine jolted, its arms shuddering as if it had hit bedrock. But this was wrong. The ground here was supposed to be clean. Surveyed. Cleared. Ordinary. The operator lifted the bucket slowly. Red dust cascading back into the trench like drifting smoke. In the glare of the headlamps, something dark and rectangular emerged from the earth, its edges uneven, its surface pitted with corrosion. The supervisor didn't swear. He didn't panic. He paused. Then he reached for his radio. "Control," he said, his voice low, strained. "I think we found something, not part of this project." The wind howled harder, whipping sand across the worksite north of El Paso, Texas. August 2019. The desert was still holding the day's heat, the air dry and sharp in the lungs. What had begun as another overnight digging shift had just crossed an invisible line, from routine to irreversible. Floodlights snapped on. Engines powered down. Workers gathered at a distance, their boots crunching against gravel and dust. No one touched the object, because instinct told them this thing did not belong to the present. When authorities arrived, they uncovered the box fully. It was rusted almost beyond recognition, wrapped in old steel wire, buried more than a meter deep, as if deliberately hidden from both sight and memory. The lid resisted at first, protesting with a long, metallic groan as forensic technicians pried it open. Inside, there was no fabric, no flesh, only silence, dry bones, arranged unnaturally still. A wristwatch, its cracked face clouded with dust, the hands frozen permanently at 9:15, and a gold wedding ring, dulled by time but intact, engraved on the inside with two small letters and a date. E to D, 1964. In that instant, the desert gave up a secret it had kept for more than 4 decades. And El Paso's longest buried question, one authorities had once dismissed, misread, or quietly abandoned, came back to life. To understand why this discovery shook an entire community, you have to go back. Back before the box, before the bones, before the watch stopped ticking. Back to a time when nothing seemed wrong at all. El Paso, 1977. In the spring of 1977, El Paso was a city defined by routine. Morning sun spilled over the Franklin Mountains, painting the desert in pale gold. Families moved through their days with predictable rhythms: work, school, church, dinner. Doors were left unlocked. Neighbors knew one another by name. The border city carried an unspoken belief that danger was something that happened elsewhere. On the east side of town lived Daniel Herrera. He was not famous, not wealthy, not powerful. He was dependable. Daniel was 36 years old, married, and known for his punctuality. He wore pressed shirts even on casual days. He drank his coffee black. He fixed his own car. Friends described him as steady, cautious, the kind of man who kept promises because breaking them never crossed his mind. Every weekday morning, Daniel left home at 7:10 a.m. Every weekday morning, he kissed his wife Elena goodbye, picked up his briefcase, and drove the same route to work, past the same gas station, the same row of mesquite trees, the same stretch of open desert that no one ever really looked at twice. On May 3rd, 1977, he did exactly that. By 9:15 a.m., Daniel Herrera was supposed to be at his desk. He never arrived. At first, no one panicked. Cars broke down. Meetings ran late. People forgot things. By noon, Elena called his office. By mid-afternoon, she called again. By evening, the worry began to sharpen into something heavier, something cold. Daniel did not come home that night, or the next, or the one after that. And when authorities were finally notified, they treated his disappearance as inconvenient, but not alarming. A grown man. No signs of struggle. No abandoned vehicle. No witnesses. No ransom demands. In 1977, cases like Daniel's fell into a category that quietly doomed them from the start. Voluntary absence. The first mistake. Police canvassed the immediate area around Daniel's route. They spoke to co-workers. They noted his calm demeanor, his lack of enemies, his stable marriage. They found nothing. No blood, no broken glass, no physical evidence suggesting a crime. The official report used careful language. Possibly left town. Personal reasons. Unknown destination. Elena insisted that Daniel would never disappear without telling her. She pointed out the untouched savings account, the clothes still hanging in the closet, the watch he never took off. But grief-stricken spouses were often emotional, officers reasoned. Too close to see clearly. The case lost urgency. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And El Paso moved on. The objects that remained. Somewhere beneath the desert, time slowed. A watch stopped at 9:15. A ring lay in darkness, its engraving untouched by light. And a metal box, sealed with wire, waited patiently beneath the shifting sand. For 42 years. While files gathered dust. While memories faded. While a trusted figure, one no one ever suspected, continued to live an ordinary life above ground. The truth was buried carefully, intentionally, and for decades it stayed that way, until a machine blade struck metal, and the desert decided it was time. In 1977, disappearance did not carry the same weight it would decades later. There were no digital footprints to freeze a moment in time. No phone pings, no traffic cameras, no credit card alerts firing off alarms. When a person vanished, the world simply kept moving, and often. So did the investigation. Daniel Herrera's disappearance began quietly enough to be mistaken for normalcy. On the morning of May 3rd, the sun rose over El Paso like it always did, spilling light across low rooftops and desert roads. Elena Herrera stood at the kitchen counter, barefoot against the cool tile, listening to the familiar sounds of routine, the hum of the refrigerator, the clink of a coffee mug, the soft rustle of paper as Daniel folded his newspaper. They spoke about nothing important, a bill that needed paying, a cousin's upcoming birthday, the heat that seemed to arrive earlier every year. Daniel checked his watch, an old silver-faced timepiece he'd owned since before they were married, and smiled faintly, already late by his own standards. "See you tonight," he said. It was an ordinary sentence. It would become the last, one she ever heard him speak. Daniel's drive to work took him along a two-lane stretch skirting the edge of the city, where development thinned and the desert pressed close. Gas stations and small businesses appeared sporadically, islands of activity, surrounded by scrub and sand. The road was familiar enough that he barely had to think about it. That familiarity would later become a problem, because no one noticed anything unusual. No screeching tires, no roadside argument, no abandoned car discovered at the shoulder. If something happened to Daniel Herrera that morning, it happened cleanly, quietly, without spectacle. By mid-morning, co-workers noticed his absence, but assumed he was running late. Daniel was reliable, yes, but even reliable men had off days. At 9:15 a.m., the office clock ticked past the moment his watch would later freeze. Still, no alarm was raised. By early afternoon, Elena's concern had sharpened into unease. Daniel had not called. He always called if plans changed. She dialed his office, her fingers tight around the receiver, listening as the phone rang unanswered. When she tried again later, a coworker picked up. "No, he never came in," the woman said. "Maybe he took the day off?" Elena hung up slowly. Daniel never took days off without notice. That evening, as the sky darkened over El Paso and porch lights blinked on across the neighborhood, Elena sat on the couch, listening for the sound of his car. Each passing minute felt louder than the last. By midnight, she was pacing. By morning, she was afraid. When Elena finally walked into the police station, she brought with her more than fear. She brought certainty. Something was wrong. The officer behind the desk listened politely, jotting down notes as she described Daniel's habits, his routine, the fact that he had no reason to leave, no history of impulsive behavior. She mentioned the watch, the ring, the way he never went anywhere without them. The officer nodded. Then he asked a question that would echo through the case for years. Is it possible he left on his own? The implication hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Men left. Marriages cracked. Lives changed, and without evidence to the contrary, that assumption often became policy. The initial search was brief and methodical, but limited. Officers drove Daniel's usual route. They checked nearby hospitals. They scanned the desert edges, where vehicles sometimes broke down. His car was never found. No skid marks, no personal items, no witnesses stepping forward to say they'd seen him pulled over or stopped. Within days, the tone of the investigation shifted. Without physical evidence, the case lost momentum. Resources were reassigned. Leads dried up before they ever formed. The official narrative began to take shape, not loudly, but subtly. Maybe he wanted to start over. Maybe there were problems at home. Maybe he crossed the border. Elena fought the idea at every turn, but grief does not carry authority. Paperwork does. And on paper, Daniel Herrera slowly became something else. Not a missing man. A missing person of uncertain circumstances. Weeks turned into months. Daniel's belongings remained untouched. His shirts still hung in the closet. His toothbrush remained dry. His watch was never found because it was no longer above ground. Friends stopped calling as often, unsure of what to say. Conversations grew awkward. Life around Elena continued while hers remained frozen. Every few weeks, she would call the police station, asking if anything new had surfaced. Nothing ever had. The case file grew thinner instead of thicker. And somewhere along the line, it slipped quietly into storage. What no one knew, what no one even considered, was that Daniel's disappearance was not the result of impulse or escape. It was the result of proximity. Because the person who knew Daniel's route, who understood his habits, who recognized his watch, who could approach him without raising alarm, was someone already woven into the fabric of his life. A person seen not as a threat, but as safe. And while El Paso continued forward, building roads, laying pipelines, expanding into the desert, the truth remained sealed in metal and wire beneath the sand. By the end of 1977, Daniel Herrera's name had become a line item, not a mystery demanding answers, not a man whose absence fractured a life, just a file, thin and unremarkable, tucked among dozens of others that arrived every year at the El Paso Police Department and quietly faded from urgency. This was not negligence in the dramatic sense. There was no villain behind a desk, no conscious decision to ignore a crime. What happened instead was something more insidious, procedural gravity. Cases without noise slowly sank. Daniel's disappearance had no violence attached to it, no bloodstains, no eyewitnesses, no abandoned vehicle. Without those anchors, investigators had nothing solid to hold on to. And without something to hold on to, they drifted. In 1977, missing adult cases were handled under a deeply flawed assumption that adults who disappeared often chose to do so. It was an assumption that required no proof. Detectives revisited Daniel's co-workers first, searching for signs of financial trouble or conflict. None surfaced. His personnel file described him as punctual, polite, and unremarkable in the way reliable men often are. They spoke again with Elena. She repeated herself calmly, even as exhaustion lined her face. Daniel had plans. Daniel had commitments. Daniel had never once failed to come home, without explanation. The detectives listened. They always listened. But listening did not mean believing. One of them asked about Daniel's friendships. Another asked about marital strain. A third asked, gently but directly, whether Daniel had ever mentioned wanting a different life. Each question chipped away at the same implication. Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. The desert offered no answers. Search teams combed nearby areas, where Daniel's car might have broken down or veered off-road. Helicopters scanned open terrain, where wreckage would have been visible from the air. Nothing appeared. The desert, vast and indifferent, revealed nothing it did not want to. And with every empty search, the likelihood of recovery diminished, not because Daniel was gone forever, but because time was being lost. Time that mattered. By early 1978, Daniel Herrera's case was officially downgraded. There was no announcement, no meeting, no formal declaration that the search was over. The calls simply stopped coming. The file was moved from an active shelf to a storage cabinet, where it would remain untouched for decades. Paper aged, ink faded, A man's existence was reduced to a manila folder labeled with a date and a name. The system did not fail loudly. It failed quietly. For Elena, the silence was unbearable. She visited the station anyway, sitting across from new faces who had never met Daniel, explaining the story again from the beginning. Each time, she noticed the same thing: the absence of urgency, the way her certainty was received as grief rather than evidence. Friends encouraged her to move on. Maybe he'll come back, some said, clinging to hope. Maybe it's better not knowing, others offered, mistaking numbness for peace. But not knowing is not neutral. It is corrosive. What no one realized, what the file did not record, was that Daniel had not vanished randomly. His disappearance followed logic, because someone had studied his habits. Someone who knew when he left, which roads he took, how he responded to authority, and how to gain his trust without force. The person responsible did not need to chase him. They only needed to intercept him. And that person was never interviewed. Not once. Because in 1977, they did not fit the profile. They were stable, respected, familiar. Someone whose presence would have felt reassuring rather than threatening. Someone who knew how to keep a secret. As years passed, the city changed. Highways expanded. Subdivisions rose from open land. The pipeline corridor where the box would one day be found didn't exist yet. Just empty desert, rolling and forgotten. Beneath that future construction site, a metal container sat undisturbed, its contents untouched by animals, erosion, or chance. Inside, the watch remained frozen. Inside, the ring waited. Inside, the truth did exactly what it was meant to do. It stayed hidden. Daniel Herrera's case did not become famous. It was never featured on the news. No reward posters went up after the first year. No task force was assembled. It became something far more dangerous than unsolved. It became inactive, and for more than 40 years, that status would protect the person responsible better than any lie ever could. The absence did not end in 1977. It stretched. It followed Elena Herrera into every year that came after, shaping her life not through answers, but through their absence. Birthdays arrived without celebration. Holidays became quieter, edged with restraint, as if joy itself might be a betrayal of the unanswered. She kept Daniel's things where they were, not as a shrine, but as proof. Proof that he had existed. Proof that his life had not simply dissolved into paperwork and assumptions. The watch was never found, so she kept its empty space in the drawer. The ring's absence hurt more. It had been Daniel's most constant possession, worn so long it left a faint mark on his finger. She imagined it slipping off somewhere random, lost to chance. The idea that it might still exist, intact, preserved, never occurred to her, because no one told her there was reason to think otherwise. As the 1980s unfolded, the city of El Paso grew outward. The desert that once felt endless began to shrink beneath roads and infrastructure. Construction sites appeared where nothing had stood before. The landscape changed so gradually that few noticed how much ground was being disturbed, how many layers of soil were being peeled back, without anyone remembering what might lie beneath. Daniel Herrera's case was never revisited during these years. There were no cold case units then, no dedicated teams assigned to reopen old files. Advances in forensic science were still years away, and even when they arrived, Daniel's case lacked the physical evidence required to benefit from them. No body, no crime scene, no suspect. In the absence of those, memory itself became the only record, and memory fades. The detectives who had first handled the case retired. Some passed away. Their notes remained, brief and clinical, offering little more than dates and dead ends. One line appeared more than once in the file. No evidence of foul play. It was a conclusion drawn not from certainty, but from silence. Time passed differently for those who remembered Daniel. Elena aged. Her hair grayed. Her voice softened. But she never stopped asking. Every few years, she would call or visit the department, hoping that a new face might look at the case differently. The responses were always polite, always cautious. We don't have anything new. Without evidence, there's not much we can do. Cases like this are very difficult. Each statement was true, and together, they meant nothing would change. The city forgot Daniel Herrera. New stories replaced old ones. New crimes demanded attention. New victims had faces and names that appeared briefly on the evening news before being replaced themselves. Daniel's name did not resurface, but the desert remembered. Wind shifted the sand. Seasons passed. The metal box remained sealed, its contents protected from the elements by chance and design. The wire held. The lid stayed shut. What had been hidden carefully stayed hidden well. By the time Elena passed away in the early 2000s, she had lived longer without Daniel than with him. She died without answers, without confirmation, without the truth she had always believed existed. Her death closed a chapter, but it did not end the story, because the story was never about closure. It was about waiting. In 2019, when the excavators struck metal beneath the pipeline site, it did more than uncover bones. It reopened time. Suddenly, a watch frozen at 9:15 was no longer just a broken object. It was a timestamp. A ring engraved in 1964 was no longer sentimental. It was evidence. And a man dismissed as a voluntary absence was no longer missing. He was found. What investigators did not yet know, what they would soon discover, was that the box had preserved more than identity. It had preserved proof. And that proof would force El Paso to confront not just a murder, but decades of assumptions that allowed it to remain buried. The desert had given up its secret. Now the system had to decide what to do with it. Within hours of the discovery, the pipeline site was sealed off. Yellow tape fluttered violently in the wind, cutting across a landscape that had not been considered a crime scene for more than 40 years. Patrol vehicles lined the dirt road, their presence drawing attention from nearby communities that had no idea what lay beneath their feet the night before. The rusted metal box was lifted carefully, every movement documented. It was transferred under escort to the El Paso County Medical Examiner's office, where time, so long denied, would finally begin moving forward again. For the first time since 1977, Daniel Herrera's case was active. The remains told a quiet but powerful story. The bones were dry, largely intact, shielded from animals and moisture by the sealed container. Forensic anthropologists worked methodically, laying each piece out on sterile tables beneath bright lights that erased decades of darkness. They determined the remains belonged to a male, approximately in his mid-30s to early 40s at the time of death. The age range aligned, the height aligned. Then came the personal effects. The watch, corroded but recognizable. The ring, engraved E to D, 1964. There was no longer doubt about whose bones these were. The man El Paso had stopped looking for had been here all along. Investigators reopened the original case file. What they found disturbed them, not because of what was inside, but because of what wasn't. No suspect list. No follow-up interviews beyond the first few weeks. No recorded timeline beyond the day Daniel disappeared. The case had not gone cold. It had been allowed to cool completely. The cause of death was harder to determine. Time had erased soft tissue. The container had preserved identity, not violence. But forensic specialists noted subtle indicators. Bone positioning inconsistent with accidental burial. Signs of blunt force trauma, consistent with a deliberate act. This was not a tragic accident. It was homicide. And suddenly, the assumptions made in 1977 collapsed under the weight of physical proof. Modern investigators approached the case differently. They began not with theories, but with objects. The watch, frozen at 9:15. It wasn't just broken. It had stopped at the moment of impact or sudden movement. That time would become a focal point, anchoring the crime to a precise window that had never been examined before. The ring, still on his finger when he was buried, which meant Daniel had not been robbed. His killer had not acted out of desperation or profit. This was personal, or procedural, intentional. Then there was the box itself. Old, heavy, transported. This was not something Daniel could have been placed into spontaneously. Someone had planned this. Someone had access to materials, tools, and time. Someone capable of moving a body without drawing attention. The desert hadn't swallowed Daniel. Someone had fed him to it. The case was reassigned to a modern cold case unit, one built on forensic science rather than assumption. Detectives re-interviewed surviving witnesses, some of whom were now elderly. their memories fragile, but still valuable. Patterns began to emerge. Daniel's route to work, the lack of witnesses, the precision of the burial. This wasn't random. This was controlled. The most important breakthrough, however, came not from the bones, but from what still remained within them: DNA. Against expectations, forensic scientists were able to extract a viable genetic profile from the remains. It wasn't complete. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough. For the first time in 42 years, Daniel Herrera could speak for himself. Not through memory, through science. The DNA was uploaded into national databases. No immediate match appeared. That was expected. The killer had never been arrested, but technology had moved beyond direct matches. Investigators turned to genetic genealogy, an emerging tool that allowed unknown DNA to be traced through distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their profiles to public databases. It was slow work. Months passed. Lines were drawn. Family trees expanded and collapsed. Names surfaced, then vanished. But slowly, inevitably, the search narrowed. And it narrowed toward someone no one had ever suspected. Someone whose name appeared in the original case file, but only once. And never again. The watch had stopped at 9:15. The ring had stayed in place. The box had waited. Now the truth was waking up. And when it did, it would shake El Paso far more violently than the desert wind ever could. The desert had spoken. Now the city had to listen. Within hours of the discovery, the gas pipeline site north of El Paso was sealed off. Yellow tape snapped violently in the wind, stretching across ground that had not been treated as significant for more than 40 years. Floodlights burned through the night as patrol units formed a perimeter, their presence attracting quiet onlookers who sensed, without yet understanding, that something old had been disturbed. The rusted metal box was lifted from the trench with deliberate care. Every angle was photographed, every movement logged. It was placed into an evidence vehicle and transported under escort to the El Paso County Medical Examiner's office, where decades of silence finally ended. For the first time since 1977, Daniel Herrera's case was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Inside the lab, forensic specialists worked slowly, methodically, stripping away layers of dust and corrosion. The remains were dry but remarkably intact, protected by the sealed container from animals, water, and erosion. Bone by bone, a man reassembled himself on stainless steel tables beneath unforgiving light. The biological profile emerged quickly. Male, mid-30s at time of death, height and build consistent with Daniel Herrera. Then came the objects. The wristwatch, its glass cracked, its mechanism seized. The hands locked permanently at 9:15. The wedding ring, still looped around bone, still engraved. E to D, 1964. Identity was no longer in question. El Paso had not lost Daniel Herrera. It had buried him. When detectives reopened the original case file, what they found was almost as disturbing as the remains themselves. There was no suspect list. No recorded follow-up interviews after the first few weeks. No timeline beyond the day Daniel disappeared. The conclusion, no evidence of foul play, had been reached without evidence of anything at all. This was not a cold case revived. It was a case that had never been allowed to live. Determining cause of death was difficult. Time had erased tissue, and the box had preserved identity rather than injury. Still, forensic anthropologists noted subtle inconsistencies. Bone positioning suggested the body had been placed, not fallen. Microfractures indicated blunt force trauma, consistent with incapacitation. This was not an accident. This was homicide. And with that determination, every assumption made in 1977 collapsed. Modern investigators shifted their focus to symbolism and sequence. The watch frozen at 9:15 was no longer incidental. It suggested a precise moment, an interruption, a confrontation, a sudden force that stopped time itself. The ring remaining on Daniel's finger ruled out robbery. There had been no frantic struggle, no hurried disposal. Whoever did this had not acted in panic. They had acted with control. The box became the most telling artifact of all. It was heavy, purpose-built, sealed with wire. This was not a spontaneous act. It required planning, tools, and privacy. Someone had moved Daniel after death, or restrained him before it, without drawing attention. Someone comfortable operating unseen. Someone who did not fear being questioned. Then came the breakthrough no one in 1977 could have imagined. DNA. Despite the years underground, technicians were able to extract a viable genetic profile from the remains. It was incomplete but usable, enough to speak across time. The profile was uploaded into national databases. No direct match appeared, but science no longer relied on direct matches. Genetic genealogy offered another path, one that traced unknown DNA through distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their profiles, unaware they might one day help solve a murder. The process was slow and painstaking. Family trees expanded. Names surfaced, then disappeared. Lines converged and collapsed, until one remained, a name buried quietly in the original case file. Mentioned once, never questioned, never suspected. The watch had stopped. The ring had waited. And now, after 42 years, the truth was no longer buried. It was narrowing in. The desert had finally given up what it had been holding. By sunrise, the gas pipeline construction site north of El Paso no longer resembled a work zone. Yellow crime scene tape cut across the sand, snapping violently in the wind. Patrol vehicles idled in a wide perimeter, their lights muted but constant, a quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred beneath the earth. Workers were sent home. Equipment was shut down. The trench where the excavator had struck metal became sacred ground. What had surfaced was no longer history. It was evidence. The rusted metal box was removed slowly, lifted from the soil inch by inch as if the ground itself resisted letting go. Decades of dust flaked away as technicians stabilized it for transport. The steel wire binding the lid was photographed before being cut, every twist documented. Nothing about this recovery was rushed. When the container arrived at the El Paso County Medical Examiner's office, time seemed to compress. 42 years of unanswered questions converged into a single room, under white lights, watched by specialists who understood the gravity of what they were about to open. The lid resisted at first, then gave way. Inside, there was no fabric left to decay, no flesh to tell its story, only dry bones, arranged with unnatural order, as if placed deliberately rather than abandoned. The remains were shielded from moisture, animals, and chance. Whoever buried this man had intended him to stay hidden. For a long time, the biological assessment began immediately. The skeletal structure indicated a male. Dental wear, bone density, and joint condition suggested an age range that aligned precisely with Daniel Herrera at the time of his disappearance. Height reconstruction matched. So did build. But it was the personal effects that erased any remaining doubt. A wristwatch lay among the bones, its glass fractured, its hands locked permanently at 9:15. Not damaged by corrosion alone, but stopped suddenly, violently, as if time itself had been interrupted. A gold wedding ring still circled a finger bone. Its engraving, though dulled, was legible. E to D, 1964. The man El Paso had stopped searching for was no longer missing. He had been waiting. Detectives reopened the original case file expecting to find forgotten leads or overlooked suspects. Instead, they found absence. The file was thin, sparse, incomplete. Interviews ended abruptly within weeks of Daniel's disappearance. No comprehensive suspect list existed. No follow-up notes indicated deeper inquiry. The conclusion, no evidence of foul play, had been written without any physical proof to support it. This was not a case that went cold over time. It had been allowed to cool almost immediately. Determining cause of death proved challenging. Soft tissue had long since vanished, and the container preserved identity rather than injury. Still, forensic anthropologists noted critical indicators. Bone positioning suggested placement, not collapse. Microfractures along the skull and upper ribs were consistent with blunt force trauma inflicted before death or shortly after. This was not misadventure. It was homicide. And with that determination, every assumption made in 1977 unraveled. Investigators began reconstructing the crime through objects rather than witnesses. The watch frozen at 9:15 became a temporal anchor, a moment when normal routine ended abruptly. It suggested confrontation, restraint, or impact. Something sudden enough to stop a mechanism designed to keep moving. The ring remaining on Daniel's finger ruled out robbery. There had been no frantic stripping of valuables, no hurried disposal. The act had not been chaotic. It had been controlled. Then there was the box itself. Heavy, durable, sealed with wire. This was not something found in desperation. It required planning, preparation, and transport. Someone had access to tools, space, and time. Someone who could move a body without drawing attention, without raising suspicion. Someone who did not fear scrutiny. The most critical breakthrough came from inside the bones themselves. Against expectation, forensic scientists extracted a viable DNA profile. It was incomplete but sufficient. A genetic voice preserved across 4 decades. The profile entered national databases. No direct match appeared, but investigators were no longer limited to direct matches. Genetic genealogy allowed them to trace the DNA through distant relatives who had submitted profiles voluntarily, unaware their data might one day solve a murder. Family trees grew. Branches were tested and eliminated. Names surfaced, then disappeared, until one line remained. It led to a name that had appeared once in 1977, and then never again. The watch had stopped. The ring had waited. And now, the truth was narrowing its focus. By dawn, the desert north of El Paso no longer felt empty. Yellow crime scene tape cut sharply across the sand, snapping and bowing under relentless wind. Patrol vehicles formed a loose perimeter around the pipeline trench, their engines idling as if unsure whether to stay or flee. Workers who had arrived expecting another routine shift were turned away quietly, told only that something had been found, something old. The rusted metal box lay at the center of it all, half-caked in red dust, its edges warped by time. It was lifted slowly from the trench, stabilized with straps, photographed from every angle. The steel wire binding the lid was brittle but deliberate, twisted tight decades earlier by hands that had known exactly what they were doing. This was not debris. This was containment. When the box was loaded into an evidence vehicle and driven away under escort, El Paso crossed an invisible threshold. A disappearance dismissed in 1977 had just become a homicide investigation in 2019. At the medical examiner's office, the atmosphere shifted from procedural to reverent. Technicians understood the rarity of what they were handling, not just remains, but time itself, preserved against all odds. The lid resisted at first, metal grinding against metal as tools worked carefully at its edges. When it finally opened, the room fell silent. Inside were dry bones, arranged with unsettling order. No fabric remained, no flesh. The container had done exactly what it was designed to do: isolate, protect, and conceal. Forensic anthropologists began their work methodically. The skeletal structure indicated a male. Bone density, dental wear, and joint condition suggested an age consistent with Daniel Herrera in 1977. Height reconstruction aligned. Build aligned. Each measurement tightened the circle of certainty. Then the personal effects were examined. A wristwatch lay among the remains, its face cracked, its mechanism frozen. The hands pointed to 9:15, not rounded, not approximate, but exact. The stoppage was not gradual. It was abrupt. A gold wedding ring still encircled a finger bone. Despite decades underground, the engraving remained legible. E to D, 1964. Identity was no longer a question. Daniel Herrera had been found. Detectives reopened the original case file expecting to uncover forgotten leads or overlooked suspects. Instead, they found emptiness. The file was thin, almost hollow. Interviews stopped after the first few weeks. Notes were brief, cautious, noncommittal. There was no suspect list. No documented follow-up on potential conflicts. The conclusion, no evidence of foul play, appeared again and again, written not as a finding, but as a default. This was not a case that went cold because leads dried up. It went cold because assumptions took their place. Determining cause of death was difficult. Time had erased soft tissue, and the container had preserved identity more than injury. Still, forensic specialists noted telling details. Bone placement suggested deliberate positioning, not collapse. Subtle fractures along the skull and upper torso were consistent with blunt force trauma, injuries inflicted before death or immediately after. This was not misadventure. This was homicide. With that determination, every narrative built in 1977 collapsed. Daniel had not left voluntarily. He had not disappeared into another life. He had been stopped. Investigators shifted their focus from theories to symbols. The watch frozen at 9:15 became a fixed point in time, a moment when routine ended. It suggested interruption, confrontation, or force. Something sudden enough to stop a mechanism designed to keep moving. The ring still on Daniel's finger ruled out robbery. There had been no frantic stripping of valuables, no hurried disposal. The act had not been chaotic or impulsive. It had been controlled. Then there was the box itself. Heavy, durable, sealed. This was not something acquired in desperation. It required planning, tools, and forethought. Someone had access to materials and a place to work unseen. Someone capable of moving a body without attracting attention. Someone who understood how to avoid suspicion. Someone comfortable operating within systems, not outside them. The most significant breakthrough came from within the bones themselves. Against expectations, forensic scientists extracted a viable DNA profile. It was incomplete, degraded by time, but usable. A genetic signature preserved across 4 decades. The profile was entered into national databases. No direct match appeared. That did not discourage investigators. Modern forensics no longer relied solely on direct hits. Genetic genealogy offered another path, one that traced unknown DNA through distant relatives who had submitted profiles to public databases, often for reasons as innocent as curiosity about ancestry. The process was slow. Family trees expanded, branched, collapsed. Names surfaced, were tested, and eliminated. Each exclusion narrowed the field, tightening focus rather than diffusing it. Months passed. Then one line remained. It led back to El Paso, to a name that had appeared once in 1977, mentioned briefly, then forgotten. A name associated not with suspicion, but with familiarity, with trust. The watch had stopped at 9:15. The ring had waited in darkness. And now, after 42 years, the truth was no longer buried beneath sand and assumption. It was rising, and it was pointing somewhere very specific. The name did not surface dramatically. There was no gasp in the room, no sudden realization that snapped everything into focus. Instead, it appeared quietly at the end of a narrowing line of data, one branch of a family tree that refused to collapse no matter how many others were eliminated. It was a name investigators had already seen, not as a suspect, not as a person of interest, just a presence. In the original 1977 file, it appeared once, almost casually, buried in the background notes. No follow-up, no questions, no red ink or margin stars to signal importance. At the time, there had been no reason to look closer. That, investigators now realized, had been the advantage. Genetic genealogy had pointed them toward a family cluster rooted in the El Paso area, active in the late 1970s, with overlapping proximity to Daniel Herrera's daily routine. The DNA did not accuse anyone outright. It suggested relationships, siblings, cousins, extended connections that gradually narrowed the field. Each elimination sharpened the focus. Eventually, only one individual fit all remaining parameters: age, location, opportunity, and, perhaps most importantly, access. In 1977, this person was known as dependable. They held a position that required public trust. Their role placed them naturally along Daniel's route to work, at hours that aligned disturbingly well with the watch frozen at 9:15. Their presence on that stretch of road would not have caused alarm. In fact, it would have done the opposite. It would have reassured. Investigators pulled employment records, some of which had been stored on microfilm and paper, so old it flaked at the edges when handled. They reconstructed schedules, cross-referenced locations, examined old duty logs. Patterns emerged. There were gaps, unaccounted minutes, unexplained deviations that had never been questioned because no one had been looking. Back then, there had been no body, no crime, Now there was both. Surveillance, as we understand it today, did not exist in 1977, but habits did. Human behavior left traces even before cameras captured everything. Daniel left home at the same time each morning. He drove the same route. He responded predictably to authority and routine. The person now under scrutiny understood that. They would have known how to stop Daniel without force, how to ask him to pull over, how to speak in a tone that discouraged resistance rather than provoked it. Nothing about the interaction would have looked wrong. Not to passing drivers, not to Daniel himself. Detectives did not rush. They couldn't. The suspect had lived a full life in the decades since Daniel's disappearance. They were respected, embedded, and largely invisible in the way long-standing community figures often are. Any misstep could collapse the case permanently. So investigators rebuilt the past slowly. They re-interviewed witnesses who were still alive, asking different questions than those posed in 1977. Not what happened, but who was present. Not what you saw, but what felt normal at the time. Small recollections surfaced. A vehicle seen parked where it didn't belong. A uniform remembered vaguely, dismissed at the time as routine. A sense, recalled only in hindsight, that something had been off, but not enough to question. Individually, these memories meant nothing. Together, they began to align. The symbolic objects returned again and again. The watch at 9:15 matched the suspect's schedule window. The box suggested access to tools and storage space. The burial location fell within an area the suspect would have known intimately decades before construction reshaped the land. Coincidence after coincidence collapsed under its own weight. Investigators faced a critical dilemma. The DNA was indirect, the evidence circumstantial. Powerful, but not yet enough. They needed confirmation. They needed the suspect's DNA. But asking for it openly would raise alarms. And the suspect was not careless. So they waited, they watched, and they planned. Because the person responsible for Daniel Herrera's death had evaded suspicion for 42 years, not through brilliance, but through position and perception. They had been trusted. And trust, once given, is the hardest thing to take away. By the time investigators fully understood who they were looking at, the suspect had already lived an entire second life. Not a hidden one, an ordinary one. They had married, raised children, earned respect. Their name appeared on community rosters, professional acknowledgments, and holiday cards. To neighbors and colleagues, they were dependable, someone who showed up on time, followed rules, and blended so seamlessly into daily life that no one ever thought to look twice. That, detectives realized, was not incidental. It was structural. In 1977, this person occupied a role that came with quiet authority. Their presence carried legitimacy. When they spoke, people listened. When they asked questions, they were answered. When they intervened, it was assumed they had reason. That authority did not expire when Daniel Herrera disappeared. It matured. Over the years, the suspect's career advanced. Responsibilities increased. The uniform, literal or figurative, was eventually replaced by a civilian version of the same trust. Even after retirement, the residue of respect remained. People still nodded, still deferred, and because of that, no one revisited the past. Investigators rebuilt the suspect's timeline year by year. They traced employment records, property deeds, vehicle registrations. They mapped life events against Daniel's disappearance, looking not for drama, but for overlap. What emerged was unsettling in its consistency. On the morning Daniel vanished, the suspect had been on duty, or at least scheduled to be, in the same geographic corridor Daniel traveled daily. There were no witnesses placing them together, but there didn't need to be. In 1977, proximity was invisible. The burial site offered another quiet confirmation. Long before pipeline construction reshaped the area, the land had been open desert, used occasionally, known intimately only by those who worked nearby or passed through regularly. The suspect had reason to know that terrain, to understand which areas were rarely disturbed, which were unlikely to draw attention. The choice of location was not random. It was informed. Detectives also began examining the suspect's behavior in the years following Daniel's disappearance. There were no confessions, no slips, no sudden relocations. The suspect had stayed. People who flee often draw attention. People who stay often disappear into normalcy. The objects resurfaced again. The box required storage space and privacy. The suspect had access to both. A garage, a shed, a workplace where tools were commonplace and questions were not asked. The watch frozen at 9:15 aligned precisely with a break in the suspect's documented activities that morning. A gap small enough to go unnoticed then, but large enough to matter now. Nothing about this required imagination, only patience. Investigators also considered motive. There was no financial gain, no apparent rivalry, no known dispute recorded in the file, which meant the motive was likely situational. A confrontation that escalated, a decision made quickly, a mistake followed by a solution. The box was not evidence of long-term obsession. It was evidence of containment. As detectives quietly assembled the case, they faced an uncomfortable truth. This person had benefited from institutional blind spots, not because of corruption, but because of assumption. In 1977, people in positions of authority were not easily questioned. Their presence explained itself. Their actions were contextualized as necessary. The system had not protected the suspect intentionally. It had simply trusted them. That trust had allowed a murder to remain hidden for more than 4 decades. And now, as investigators closed in, they knew something else with certainty. The arrest, if it came, would not just shock a family. It would shock an entire community that had believed for years that nothing like this could happen in plain sight. But before that could happen, there was one final step: confirmation. DNA does not rely on memory. It does not bend to reputation. And once obtained, it does not lie. They did not knock on the door. Not yet. Investigators understood that once the suspect sensed attention, decades of quiet would fracture instantly. Any misstep could erase the final chance at certainty. This was not a case built on confession or confrontation. It was built on proof, and proof required patience. The plan was simple, clinical, and invisible. Obtain DNA without alerting the suspect. In 1977, such an idea would have been impossible. In 2019, it was routine. The suspect lived an ordinary life, governed by habits as predictable as Daniel Herrera's had once been. Morning coffee, errands, conversations with neighbors who saw nothing unusual in a familiar face moving through familiar spaces. Investigators watched from a distance, careful never to linger long enough to be noticed. They waited for discard. It happened without drama. A paper cup, a napkin, a piece of trash dropped into a public bin, an object touched by the suspect, abandoned without thought, its significance invisible to everyone except the people waiting for it. When it was retrieved, sealed, and logged, no one celebrated. The moment was too quiet for that. This was not victory. It was alignment. The sample was rushed to the lab. Chain of custody was airtight. Contamination controls were strict. The science had no room for doubt. Analysts worked methodically, comparing the genetic material from the discarded item to the profile extracted from Daniel Herrera's remains. The process took days, then weeks. Then a phone call arrived that none of the investigators would forget. The DNA matched. Not a distant cousin. Not a partial overlap. A direct, undeniable match. The room fell silent. 42 years collapsed into a single result. The man who had been trusted. The man who had blended into ordinary life. The man who had never once been questioned. Was now, conclusively, the person connected to Daniel Herrera's death. But even then, the work was not finished. DNA told them who. It did not yet tell them how. Or why. Investigators returned to the evidence with renewed clarity. They reconstructed the likely sequence of events, minute by minute, grounded now in confirmation rather than theory. The stop, the compliance, the interruption at 9:15. They did not speculate wildly. They did not embellish. They let the facts speak in their own restrained way. Arresting the suspect required coordination. This was not someone who would run, not someone who would resist openly, but it was someone whose identity had been built on trust. An arrest would reverberate outward, through family, former colleagues, and a community that believed it knew its own. Prosecutors reviewed the case carefully. 42-year-old homicides were fragile things. Every assumption had to be backed by evidence. Every conclusion had to withstand scrutiny. The box, the burial, the watch, the ring, the DNA. Together, they told a story that time had failed to erase. When the warrant was finally approved, there was no announcement, no media presence, just a quiet decision that the past had waited long enough. The suspect was arrested without incident. No chase, no resistance, just the end of a life lived in plain sight, and the beginning of accountability. The arrest did not look like justice. There were no sirens screaming through the neighborhood, no shouting, no dramatic struggle captured on shaky phone footage. To anyone watching from a distance, it appeared almost mundane. A pair of unmarked vehicles, a brief exchange of words, a man stepping calmly into the back seat. But for the city of El Paso, it was seismic, because the man being arrested was not a stranger. He was familiar. The suspect was taken into custody early, before the day could harden into routine. Officers approached him in a neutral space, their tone measured, respectful. There was no need for force. He did not ask why. He did not resist. If there was surprise, it did not show. To investigators, that composure was telling. It suggested not innocence, but rehearsal, a life lived for decades with the quiet knowledge that this moment could arrive. News of the arrest spread slowly at first, contained within law enforcement circles and court filings. Then a name leaked, and once it did, the reaction was immediate and disorienting. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the image they knew with the charge being whispered. Former colleagues replayed years of interactions, searching for something, anything, they had missed. Community members spoke in the same stunned refrain. He never seemed like that. They were right. He hadn't. Court documents outlined the charge, murder, tied to the death of Daniel Herrera, missing since 1977. For many, it was the first time they had ever heard Daniel's name. For others, it reopened wounds that had never closed. Inside the interrogation room, the suspect was offered water. He sat upright, hands folded, listening as investigators explained the evidence calmly, methodically. The box, the burial site, the watch frozen at 9:15, the ring engraved in 1964, the DNA. Each detail was presented without accusation, without flourish. There was no need for theatrics. Science did not require them. The suspect listened. He did not deny knowing Daniel Herrera. That admission alone shifted the room. In 1977, the connection had gone unnoticed, filed away as insignificant. Now it carried weight. Investigators pressed gently, allowing silence to do its work. When asked about the morning of May 3, 1977, the suspect paused. Time, once frozen at 9:15, began to move again. Outside the room, prosecutors prepared for the long road ahead. They understood the challenge of trying a case this old. Memories fade. Witnesses disappear. Defense strategies grow sharper with time. But they also understood something else. This case was no longer built on recollection. It was built on physical truth. For Daniel Herrera's remaining family members, nieces, nephews, distant relatives who had grown up with only fragments of his story, the arrest was both relief and shock. Many had assumed the case would remain unresolved forever. Now, a man they had never met was being named responsible for a death they had lived in the shadow of. There was no celebration, only gravity. The arrest rewrote the city's memory. It forced El Paso to confront an uncomfortable reality, that a murder had lived among them unnoticed, protected not by complexity, but by familiarity. The idea that danger looks obvious collapsed. The idea that trust equals safety fractured. As the suspect was led from the station later that day, cameras waited. Flashes lit the sidewalk. His face appeared briefly on the evening news. Not monstrous, not theatrical, but disturbingly ordinary. For many watching, that was the most unsettling part, because it meant the past had never left. It had simply learned how to blend in. The arrest marked the beginning, not the end, of the investigation. 42 years of unanswered questions did not vanish in a single headline or a single court filing. They demanded reconstruction, scrutiny, and patience. Investigators, now armed with both DNA confirmation and the historical record, began piecing together a narrative that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. First, they revisited the crime scene. Though not the desert in its current state, construction had altered the terrain significantly. Where once the desert stretched unbroken, there were now pipelines, graded soil, and equipment trails. Investigators relied on aerial maps from the 1970s, old photographs, and workers' recollections of the area before the modern infrastructure existed. They reconstructed the location of the burial, the depth of the box, and the logistics required to conceal a body with such precision. Each detail revealed careful planning, a level of premeditation previously unrecognized. Then came the timeline. For years, investigators had known only the approximate window when Daniel Herrera disappeared. The frozen watch at 9:15 now became the anchor. Every known detail from the morning of May 3, 1977, was examined. Work schedules, eyewitness statements, weather records, traffic patterns, and commuting habits. The objective was to establish precisely who could have had the opportunity to commit the crime and maintain secrecy in the hours surrounding that moment. The suspect's own life provided clarity. Their routine aligned unerringly well with Daniel's. The stop, the encounter, the subsequent concealment of the body, all could have occurred without anyone noticing. The suspect's familiarity with the area, their access to tools and a private workspace, and their history of disciplined, predictable behavior, all became pieces of a puzzle that fit seamlessly. It was a pattern so mundane, so ordinary, that it had once shielded them from suspicion. Investigators also analyzed the burial method. The rusted metal box, sealed with steel wire, had been buried over a meter deep, carefully placed in a location chosen to avoid future discovery. Experts noted that moving a body in such a manner requires physical strength, timing, and knowledge of the terrain. It was not spontaneous. It was deliberate. Each measurement, each calculation of placement, revealed intent. Every object told a story. The watch, halted at 9:15, confirmed the moment life ended. The wedding ring, engraved with E to D, 1964, indicated the victim had not been robbed or discarded recklessly. It was personal. Each artifact reinforced the conclusion that the crime had been planned, controlled, and executed by someone who understood both the victim and the environment in which the crime would occur. Investigators sought witnesses who could fill gaps in the timeline. Many memories had faded. Some people had died. Yet subtle recollections emerged. A neighbor remembered seeing a familiar vehicle parked at an unusual time. A former colleague recalled a conversation with the suspect years later that, in hindsight, seemed rehearsed. A passerby noted a figure moving oddly near the location, dismissed at the time as ordinary. These fragmented observations, when combined with the physical evidence and modern forensic analysis, began to reconstruct the sequence of events. Forensic specialists also re-examined the remains in light of new information. Subtle injuries on the bones, previously assumed to be incidental, now suggested methodical restraint and incapacitation. The skeletal evidence, combined with the burial and associated objects, reinforced that this was not an accident, not a disappearance, but murder. Every scientific analysis, from bone trauma to soil composition, aligned with the investigative timeline. The DNA match that had led to the suspect became the backbone of prosecution. It was irrefutable and tied directly to the burial site, the victim, and indirectly to the original disappearance. Investigators compiled a case that could withstand scrutiny, pairing the decades-old evidence with contemporary science. What emerged from this painstaking reconstruction was chilling in its clarity. The murder had been executed with precision, hidden by time and trust, yet recorded in every small detail: the watch, the ring, the burial site, the suspect's predictable behavior. 42 years of silence had not erased the truth. It had merely concealed it, waiting for the moment when evidence could finally speak. While investigators rebuilt the timeline and collected evidence, the emotional truth of the case unfolded elsewhere, in the quiet corners of the Herrera family home. 42 years of uncertainty had created invisible scars, shaping lives in ways that could not be quantified or dismissed. Daniel's disappearance had not just removed a man from the family. It had removed the sense of certainty, the expectation that the world made sense, that actions had consequences, and that justice would eventually arrive. Elena Herrera had lived with absence. Every morning she set the table for two, only one place occupied. Every holiday, every birthday, carried a tension between hope and despair. Years of unanswered calls to the police, years of being told there was nothing new, eroded faith in systems designed to protect. Friends and extended family offered platitudes. Maybe he'll come back. But even well-meaning words could not repair the emptiness left behind. She kept Daniel's personal items carefully preserved, clothing folded neatly in drawers, small mementos arranged in boxes, each a testament to life interrupted, each a reminder of a man who had vanished without explanation. For Daniel's siblings, the impact was different but equally profound. Decisions in their own lives were guided by the shadow of the unknown. Marriages, careers, and parenthood were approached cautiously, shaped by the underlying anxiety that the world could take someone without warning. Every newspaper report of crime in El Paso triggered a familiar unease, a reminder that the disappearance had never been resolved. The family existed in a liminal state, grief without closure, fear without incident, memory without context. When news of the 2019 discovery reached them, the first reaction was disbelief. A body, unearthed decades later, accompanied by artifacts, wristwatch stopped at 9:15, ring engraved with initials, made the unimaginable tangible. It was a relief, yes, but also a shock. The confirmation forced them to confront the violence that had been abstract for more than 40 years. They could finally name the reason for Daniel's absence, but the price of knowledge was raw and immediate. The family was brought into the process carefully. Investigators knew the importance of timing, of framing the revelation with sensitivity. They presented the findings, the bones, the personal effects, the confirmation of identity, slowly, deliberately, allowing the weight to settle before offering context. In the faces of Daniel's nieces and nephews, investigators observed what they could not see in 1977, a grief sharpened by time, refined by decades of unanswered questions, and now confronted by undeniable proof. Counselors were offered, and private spaces prepared for the family to absorb the details. The first time they touched Daniel's preserved belongings in a forensic setting, it was both familiar and alien. The watch, the ring, the traces of the man they had only known in memory. They were real, present, and undeniable. It was a physical reminder that Daniel had existed, that his life had mattered, and that for 42 years, the truth had been obscured not by mystery, but by neglect and circumstance. Even as emotions ran high, the family recognized the significance of the arrest. Justice had been delayed but not denied. The man responsible was in custody, the crime documented with precision, and the city itself forced to reconcile with decades of oversight. While relief did not erase grief, it created a framework for closure, a structure around which healing could begin. For the family, this was the moment decades of uncertainty had been suspended in time finally intersected with resolution. It was quiet, profound, and fragile. They returned to the desert in their minds, imagining the ordinary life Daniel had once led, the routine interrupted, the final moments memorialized by a watch stopped at 9:15. In their grief, they acknowledged that Daniel had been found, that truth had survived decades of silence, and that justice, however delayed, had arrived. The Herrera family's long wait had ended, not in celebration, but in the solemn acknowledgement that life, even interrupted by tragedy, could eventually be reclaimed through truth. The arrest was only the beginning of the reckoning. In the courtroom, the decades-long absence of evidence weighed heavily against both the prosecution and the defense. Memories had faded. Witnesses had aged, some deceased. But the physical evidence, the box, the bones, the watch, the ring, and most importantly, the DNA, was immutable. It had been preserved across time, impervious to the erosion of memory or circumstance. Court proceedings moved slowly. Prosecutors constructed the case meticulously, knowing that the extraordinary gap between crime and discovery would be scrutinized. They introduced the sequence of events reconstructed from archival records, witness statements, and modern forensic analysis. The jury listened as experts described the burial, the trauma to the bones, and the calculated concealment of the body. Each object was presented not as a curiosity, but as testimony, the watch frozen at 9:15, marking the exact interruption of Daniel Herrera's life. The wedding ring, evidence that the act had been personal, deliberate, and not opportunistic. The defense sought to create doubt, pointing to the age of evidence, potential contamination, and the passage of time. But science spoke clearly. DNA linked the suspect unequivocally to the remains. The methodical burial, the choice of location, and the alignment of behaviors all pointed to premeditation and control. It was no longer theory or speculation. It was fact. During the trial, the community began to absorb the full weight of the crime. For decades, El Paso had lived with a disappearance that had been almost forgotten. Now the case resurfaced, demanding acknowledgement. Friends, neighbors, and co-workers grappled with the unsettling truth. The killer had been known, trusted, and ordinary. Ordinary, yes, but calculated, capable, and patient. The realization shattered assumptions that time protects innocence, that familiarity is safety, and that justice inevitably arrives without effort. The family attended every session, their presence a silent assertion that Daniel's life mattered. Each piece of evidence brought both pain and relief. The pain of confronting a violent past, and the relief of validation. After so many years, the physical truth of Daniel's existence and death was no longer abstract. It had a name, a timeline, and accountability. Testimonies from forensic experts were critical. They explained the extraction of DNA from decades-old remains, the painstaking genealogical work that led to the suspect, and the reconstruction of the crime scene based on both environmental and circumstantial evidence. The jury was shown photographs of the recovered objects, diagrams of the burial site, and timelines correlating the suspect's activities with the final moments of Daniel's life. Each presentation reinforced the certainty of guilt while highlighting the extraordinary effort required to bridge decades of silence. In the end, the verdict did not surprise anyone who had followed the evidence. The jury found the suspect guilty of murder. After 42 years, justice, delayed but unwavering, had arrived. The sentence, read aloud in the hushed courtroom, was a formal acknowledgement that accountability transcends time. It was a measure of closure not only for Daniel's family, but for a community that had been left with unanswered questions for more than 4 decades. Outside the courthouse, the city absorbed the magnitude of what had transpired. Media coverage highlighted the procedural failures of the past, the advances in forensic science that had enabled the breakthrough, and the extraordinary patience of investigators and family members alike. Editorials reflected on institutional oversight and the human capacity for concealment, while residents grappled with the unsettling realization that danger can inhabit ordinary spaces without detection. For the Herrera family, the aftermath was contemplative rather than celebratory. They returned to memories of Daniel's life, imagining the mornings he walked to work, the laughter shared in quiet moments, the ordinary joys interrupted. They visited the sites connected to the discovery and reconstruction, acknowledging the long silence and the years spent wondering if answers would ever arrive. In the presence of closure, they found not elation, but a profound sense of resolution, the certainty that Daniel had not been forgotten, that truth had survived decades of neglect, and that justice, though delayed, had been delivered. The El Paso 1977 case became a reference point for both law enforcement and the public, a demonstration of the resilience of evidence, the importance of persistent investigation, and the transformative power of modern forensic science. It underscored that while time can obscure, it cannot annihilate truth. And for Daniel Herrera, the story that began with disappearance and despair concluded with acknowledgement, accountability, and finally, peace. Even after the verdict, the desert north of El Paso remained unchanged. Wind swept across the red soil, carrying dust and debris over the trench where Daniel Herrera had been discovered. To the casual observer, it was an ordinary stretch of land, silent and unremarkable. Yet beneath that stillness lay decades of concealed history, a story that had finally been told, piece by piece, through bone, artifact, and meticulous investigation. Investigators returned to the site one final time, not to reopen a case, but to acknowledge the truth it had preserved. The trench, now partially refilled and graded, held the imprint of a crime that had been invisible for more than 40 years. Every footprint, Every rusted shard and every displaced stone reminded them of the careful, calculated decisions made by someone who had thought their actions would remain buried forever. The watch, once frozen at 9:15, had been removed as evidence, preserved in climate-controlled conditions to maintain its forensic value. Yet, in the minds of those who worked the case, it remained a symbol of a moment in time when life abruptly ended. The ring, engraved with the initials E to D, 1964, became more than a piece of jewelry. It became a testament to personal connections, to relationships severed too soon, and to the intimate nature of the crime. Objects that had once been ordinary now carried extraordinary significance, bridging decades and connecting the living to the dead. For the community, the case prompted reflection. How many other crimes had slipped into silence because they occurred under the guise of normalcy? How often had trust been misinterpreted as safety? The arrest and conviction forced El Paso to confront uncomfortable truths, that a murderer could blend into daily life, that time alone does not obscure culpability, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can eventually emerge. Meanwhile, the Herrera family began a slow, careful process of healing. They visited Daniel's childhood neighborhood, tracing his old routes, recounting memories, and imagining what his life could have been. They shared stories with younger generations, ensuring that Daniel's life, though cut short, was remembered not just as a victim but as a person, brother, nephew, and son. The closure, though fragile, allowed grief to transform into something else: remembrance, reflection, and quiet resilience. Law enforcement used the case as a benchmark for training. Officers studied the combination of traditional investigative methods and modern forensic techniques that had finally brought resolution. The case demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence, even in cases that appear unsolvable. It reinforced the idea that persistence, coupled with advancements in technology, can bridge decades of silence. Yet the arrest did more than deliver justice. It reminded everyone involved that time does not erase responsibility. The suspect, once trusted and respected, would now carry the weight of decades of hidden actions. Their ordinary life, meticulously constructed to blend into the background, had unraveled under the scrutiny of science and dedication. The revelation was a stark lesson. Appearances can deceive, but accountability is relentless. As the sun set over the desert, casting long shadows over the red earth, investigators, family members, and community observers alike reflected on the fragility and resilience of life, memory, and justice. Daniel Herrera's story, frozen for decades at 9:15, had finally moved forward. It had emerged from silence and secrecy into the light of truth, forever altering the landscape of a city that had once considered his disappearance unsolvable. In the quiet aftermath, the desert kept its watch. Wind still swept over the land, sand shifting with the passage of time. Yet unlike before, the echoes of the past now carried the certainty of resolution. A life lost, a crime revealed, and a community reminded that even the deepest concealment cannot outlast the determination of truth. The city of El Paso, after decades of unanswered questions, was forced to reckon with the quiet violence that had existed within its borders. News outlets recounted the discovery, the arrest, and the conviction with a mix of awe and disbelief. Commentators focused on the rarity of such a case, a disappearance, unresolved for more than 40 years, solved not by chance, but by meticulous science, persistence, and unyielding dedication. Public discussion centered on the lessons learned, not only about investigative technique, but about trust, perception, and the hidden depths of human behavior. For law enforcement, the case became both a cautionary tale and a triumph. Officers reviewed protocols, revisiting the 1977 file to identify where assumptions had derailed an early investigation. They examined the way witnesses were questioned, how evidence was preserved, and how subtle signs had been overlooked. Training programs incorporated the case as an example of how routine, familiarity, and societal trust can obscure even the most critical truths. Forensics units studied the preservation of DNA across decades, understanding how advanced technology could illuminate cases long considered impossible. The lessons were clear. Time does not erase responsibility, and diligence can eventually bridge even the largest gaps in history. For the Herrera family, the aftermath was deeply personal. They had waited a lifetime for clarity, and though the resolution could not undo the loss, it allowed them to reclaim some measure of peace. Memories of Daniel were no longer tinged solely with speculation and worry. They now had context, understanding, and certainty. Each story shared at family gatherings, each remembrance spoken aloud, carried new weight, an acknowledgement that their loved one had existed, had been loved, and had been taken from them by deliberate and unlawful action. Closure, while never complete, was finally within reach. Community reflection extended beyond immediate circles. Schools, civic organizations, and public forums debated the implications of a killer hidden in plain sight, someone whose ordinary appearance and respected role had shielded them from suspicion for decades. The case challenged assumptions about human nature and public safety, prompting deeper discussions about accountability, institutional oversight, and the ways communities can inadvertently enable concealment through trust and familiarity. The El Paso 1977 cold case was no longer merely a story of murder. It became a lens through which society could examine the intersection of crime, perception, and justice. At the courthouse, even the staff, clerks, judges, and attorneys felt the historical weight of the proceedings. Few cases spanned generations, bridging both technological advancements and social evolution. The courtroom became a space where past and present converged, where forensic science met human memory, and where the enduring need for justice overcame decades of inertia. Every piece of evidence, once ordinary, now extraordinary, was treated with reverence, demonstrating that even small artifacts can carry immense significance when understood in context. Psychologically, the case left its mark on everyone involved. Detectives and forensic specialists reported both relief and unease. Relief at resolving a decades-old mystery, unease at the realization of how long a crime could remain hidden. The arrest of the suspect shattered assumptions about visibility and detection, reminding investigators that danger does not always announce itself, and that the ordinary can sometimes mask the extraordinary. For the community at large, the case remained a topic of conversation and introspection long after the trial ended. It served as a reminder that closure, accountability, and the pursuit of truth are often long and winding journeys. Daniel Herrera's life, once abruptly cut short, became a symbol of resilience, the capacity of evidence, memory, and science to restore justice even after decades of silence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the El Paso desert in shades of amber and crimson, there was a sense of finality, tempered by reflection. The crime itself was over. The perpetrator had been held responsible. But the ripples of Daniel's disappearance and the subsequent investigation would continue to influence, educate, and caution future generations. The city had learned a hard lesson. That time may conceal, but it cannot ultimately erase truth. The desert remained vast and quiet, a silent witness to both the crime and its revelation. And for those who had waited, who had searched, and who had never stopped believing in the possibility of justice, there was now, at last, a measure of peace. The final chapter of the El Paso 1977 cold case was not written in headlines or courtroom transcripts. It was written in the quiet, persistent triumph of truth over time, in the meticulous reconstruction of a life interrupted, and in the enduring impact on those who had waited decades for resolution. 42 years had passed between disappearance and discovery, yet justice had not faltered. It had simply waited for the right moment, armed with evidence, science, and human perseverance. For the Herrera family, the conclusion brought a profound, if tempered, sense of closure. They no longer lived in the shadow of uncertainty, nor did they bear the burden of unanswered questions. Daniel's story had been restored, piece by piece, through the objects that had preserved his identity: the watch frozen at 9:15, the wedding ring engraved with E to D, 1964, and the meticulous placement of his remains in the desert soil. These artifacts were more than evidence. They were a bridge to memory, connecting the living to the lost in a tangible, undeniable way. The case also left a permanent imprint on the El Paso community. It was a reminder that danger and malice do not always announce themselves through chaos or violence. Sometimes they exist within the ordinary, camouflaged by trust and respectability. For decades, The suspect had moved through the city unnoticed, benefiting from familiarity and perceived integrity. The arrest and conviction revealed the fragility of assumptions and the necessity of vigilance, documentation, and accountability, even when there appears to be no immediate threat. Law enforcement reflected on the procedural failures of the past and the advancements that made resolution possible. In 1977, investigative methods were constrained by technology, oversight, and social assumptions. In 2019, forensic science, particularly DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, bridged those decades, translating decay into proof and uncertainty into conviction. The case became a touchstone for training, a testament to the ways science can intersect with human determination to overcome institutional and temporal barriers. For investigators, the case emphasized patience, persistence, and respect for the slow work of truth. Every artifact, every fragment of recollection, every archival note mattered. The rusted box unearthed in a construction trench, the long-lost watch, and the delicate ring were all conduits to justice, symbols of the enduring capacity of truth to outlast concealment. Even beyond the realm of law enforcement and family, the case influenced the collective understanding of justice in society. It demonstrated that resolution is not always immediate, that patience is a form of courage, and that the persistence of evidence can reclaim a narrative long thought lost. Daniel Herrera's life, his disappearance, and his ultimate recognition serve as a reminder that time may delay accountability, but it cannot prevent it. In the quiet of the desert, the place where the crime had been buried, the wind continued to shift the red sand, as it always had. Yet now, beneath the surface, there was no longer ambiguity or concealment, only truth. The desert, once a silent witness to violence, had become a testament to the endurance of justice and memory. For the Herrera family, the city, and the investigators who never gave up, the story of Daniel Herrera concluded not with spectacle or drama, but with certainty. A life once stolen had been acknowledged, a crime committed in plain sight had been revealed, and accountability had finally been delivered. The legacy of the El Paso 1977 cold case endures in three ways: as a narrative of persistence, as a demonstration of the transformative power of forensic science, and as a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, cannot be extinguished. Daniel Herrera's story, paused at 9:15, has now been allowed to move forward, carrying lessons, memory, and justice into the future.